Hello, and welcome to Infinite Shelf, the human-centric retail podcast. I'm your host, Ingrid Millman-Cordy, and I'm joined by...
Orchid Bertelson.
Hooray! And if you're just tuning in to this season, we are exploring all things sort of the evolution of D2C. What do we do now? We're sort of 10, 15 years into this really disruptive channel that has evolved. There are so many things that were true 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago that are very maybe untrue or considerably less true today. And there are so many topics within that between, growth and profitability, acquisition channels and what the expectations are for costs there, exit strategies, all of those things. And we intend to spend the entire season dedicated to sort of the the evolution and the aging of the D2C channel, which actually happens to parallel really well with Orchid and I's
Aging?
graceful aging. I was like, how am I going to say? But it's aging. Aging is not a dirty word, you guys.
No, it's not. It's just that men are allowed to age and women aren't. So let's just get into I'm just kidding. This is not what the
No,
episode is about, but
it is not, but it is all. That doesn't make it any less true. But so all of those things will be visited. I think that in the spirit of the fact that this is the human-centric retail podcast, I think we should be talking a lot more about the humans that are behind these brands. And Orchid, your experience right now in what you're currently doing, you see a lot of both sides, right? So do you want to just go through sort of what you're doing professionally, but then also what's happening internally?
yes, of course. So when we talk about marketing, it is an art and a science. And I think obviously there's a lot of conversation out there about artificial intelligence and what it's going to replace and what it's not. And the reality is that marketing is human centric, marketing is empathy. And so I think there's a lot of things about marketing strategy that will never be replaced. And so that makes the humans behind the brand that much more important.
Totally.
And, I came from brand side. I've kind of done this strange ping pong between brand and agency side. And there are very marked differences between the two. And I'm now on the agency side. And the reality is that agency talent tends to skew younger. You have a lot more folks who are early in your career. And in my experience, my agency, I would say that that season of my life when I started an agency was about trying to figure out what I wanted to do as it pertained to marketing.
Mhm.
And so when you're in those early stages, when you're trying to figure it out, it just looks very different. And brand
Different
side,
different than before or different from the brand side on the
I
agency
think
side?
different from the brand side. I think,
Mm.
of course, and we'll talk about this more as well. I think what it meant to be agency side is different between creative agency or marketing performance agency. I mean, there's those dynamics, but it is certainly a larger contrast when you look at agency versus brand. So when I first went from creative agency to brand side, I noticed that marketing associates at a brand all had MBAs. I was the only one that didn't have one, right? And when you talk to a marketing manager or marketing director, you're talking to someone who might be already 15 to 20 years into their career.
Yeah,
Whereas on the agency side, if you're talking to an account director, it's likely that you're talking to someone under 30. So one of those mismatches in titles and also, what the title represented in terms of experience was a pretty big gap going from agency to brand side.
totally. Yeah. And I would even add that the evolution of agencies and how they're configured is fundamentally different today than it was even when I was on the agency side. Um, Shout out Barbarian Group. Um,
Am I
all
supposed to
right.
do that with my old agency?
I'm just like I'm one of those corny people who like loves my old agency. So but ultimately what it was we were a full service agency. and the landscape of agencies and what agencies do has changed dramatically. And I don't want to change the topic, but like that's another thing where like it used to be where you were like this jack of all trades and you had to know a little bit about performance and a little bit about creative and a little bit about awareness and top of funnel stuff. And it was just a little bit of, it was very much that. But when you didn't know, there was always someone to your right and to your left who did and who can help fill in those gaps. And I think that some of the challenges with like agency personnel today is that they're so specialized and they only think about like their component, that it can be challenging when you're the client side and you're like, wait, you didn't think about like the repercussions of what is going to happen here. And so there's that whole element to it. But I think originally when we were talking about this sort of in preparation, we were talking about the actual quality of people that we are exposed to. And I think like the younger generation, and I think there's just some differences in how we approach work and the world and problem solving and taking initiative and things like that. And so, I was curious, Orchid, like how are you feeling about this new generation coming into the workforce, like the Gen Xers?
Oh, the Gen Zers. I think we're
Oh,
closer to
sorry,
Gen
Gen
X,
Zers.
right?
Gen
Um,
Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is cultural and contextual. So when you think about Gen Zers entering into the workforce, and what their experience was like relative to ours, I do think that COVID and remote working has done them a disservice.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
remember early on in our careers where people would last minute pull us into a conference room and they'd say, stand in the back, shut up, take notes, watch how it's done. And we did so much learning by osmosis. We
Mhm.
remember watching in an open office space, watching the top performers walk by and just seeing how they engaged and interacted with different people on different teams. There was so much that you could absorb that wasn't a part of you heads down working on the project or the task that you were assigned.
Totally.
Whereas now, when you look at the remote workforce, your experience is in a Zoom box,
Yeah.
right? And so it becomes a very transactional, it becomes very specific, and it also becomes, in order to succeed in this world as a manager managing someone across Zoom, is that you have to be incredibly intentional about the
Mm.
coaching and the training and the documentation and the guidance and the documentation when it comes to something that a tangible thing that they can reference back to, right? Like,
Mhm.
this is what good looks like. And so I
Yeah.
do think a lot of it is contextual of this age of COVID. And then I think when we think about culturally, and we were talking about this, I graduated college in '05, so a couple years before you. And I was lovingly, referring to Zuck, because we're about the same age, similar levels of accomplishment, obviously. And Facebook was created my sophomore
Are
year
you
of
destroying the
college.
world too, Orchid? I don't even know.
I don't know. What
Yeah.
is he even doing? I mean, I take my sunscreen cues from him, really. Really got to get that zinc
Zinc.
oxide. Yeah. So you got to keep those wrinkles away.
Zinc Lord.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think we grew up in this age of Facebook where I remember studying abroad in Germany my junior year of college. And there are all these embarrassing photos that were captured on a digital camera, of which I never connected to my laptop, right? So, thankfully, those things do not exist. If for some reason one of my old college buddies is in the audience and has those photos, please also pretend like those don't
Yeah.
exist.
Also, how dare you?
Exactly. And so we were able to fail in a very private or limited way in which
Yeah,
this new generation cannot, because
totally.
everything is public, right? From the time that they were born, I mean, think about how many parents created a special hashtag for their kid or created social media accounts for their kid. And so this failure becomes permanent, right? Because
Yep,
everything on the internet lives forever. And so
yep.
I do think that there is a cultural context that is shaping the new workforce as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said, and I would even say that, like, Gen Z, the point you made initially about having no, like, actual workspace to go into for the most part, the what we benefited from, what is happening, at least from my vantage point, is those soft skills of being able to like, yeah, watch those high performers and just like see how they navigate conversations and see how they problem solve and see how they like continuously add value outside of like even their little box that they're in. And that sort of just introduces you to more and more people and shows more people how valuable you are and that whole loop. I think that they've lost that opportunity, right? And even just the I have really, really distinct memories of having those like happy hour moments with someone who I admired or someone who I, wanted to learn things from and getting the chance to like over a cocktail, ask them questions, share some vulnerabilities or whatever it was. And it's unfortunate. Like, I love the work from home thing based on, like, where I'm at
Same.
in my world, right? Like, I had the privilege of, like, having my first 10, 15 years of my relationship with my work relationship to to build those relationships, have those soft skills developed, watch like the masters in action, if you will. And then now like I'm a mom and I have all these things that I'm juggling, and so being able to be flexible with when I'm working and like I can after bedtime log back in and do what I need to do and all that kind of stuff. In my phase, I'm largely benefiting from it, and my work is actually improved too, right? Because I have the time where I can really focus. I'm not like commuting, all this nonsense. But for the younger generation, man, they're really missing out on being able to form those relationships, observe those soft skills, and all of that. I think it's also like a totally separate thing of the I don't know if it's generational or not. Like I kind of hate putting the big like generation tag on everything. I think it's just maybe it's an expression of this same sort of soft skill miss like not being able to cultivate that. But I think it's also this ownership conversation where it's like, oh, this is my job. I'm going to log in, I'm going to log off, I'm going to like do it to the best of my ability, but then like if I can't complete a task because there was like a small thing in my way, like that's all of a sudden something that I think the younger generation or the newer people in the workforce feel is appropriate to say is like what's happening. Um, and I don't know, what do you feel like have you had any experiences along those lines?
Yes. So part of it is that again, we occupy an interesting space in history as the elder millennials, geriatric millennials, millenni-olds. I mean, whatever your
Millenni-olds is my new
preferred.
favorite
I
one.
love millenni-olds, as whatever your favorite moniker is for our generation. Is that we sit in that gap of pre-technology to technology, right? When I was 10 years old, I logged on to Prodigy for the first time through my parents' landline. And
Yeah.
and so what's interesting is that when you grow up in that world and all of a sudden all the world's information is at your fingertips and
Mhm.
you're able to literally Google anything, that I think that that's actually a lot of the difference is that if I don't know something, I'm just going to Google it. Like, I know I'm not supposed to have all the answers. And so, whether it's a white paper, whether it is a template for an org chart that I want to put together, like, I know that that information is out there.
Yep.
And I don't really know what it's attributed to, but it feels like I've had interactions where people want to be given the information
Mm.
versus seek it out for themselves. And I actually don't know if it's tied to media literacy as a piece, because and the running joke is that, hey, if it's on the internet it must be true. Right? Is
Yes.
that we also sit in this gap where Wikipedia started while I was in college,
Mhm.
and the question of whether or not it can actually be cited as an accurate source. And so it's entirely possible that this generation coming up in the world might not trust or have the experience to know which sources of information to trust versus not. But
Mm.
that's just me playing armchair
Psychologist.
psychiatrist. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's points to that, but I guess we're maybe maybe there's something in the, like we lived in the world before the internet, and we knew how difficult it was to to get access to information and resources.
I mean, I
And
faxed. I sent faxes.
right, yeah. Oh, me too. I would go to the library and like look up the encyclopedia and like
That's
write.
Dewey Decimal System.
Yes, totally. So like, and so I think that there had been back then when it first came available to us, but even still now, there's like this spark of joy that happens knowing that we can like go on the internet and like find a resource for us like at our fingertips, and that's so cool. And I think, there's going to be further implications of like AI in that too, and I think that's the next evolution of that. That's a whole other topic. But I guess having had the two different worlds and being able to sort of take pride in the fact that we can go on the internet and fend for ourselves and get the information, there was like an excitement to that I don't know if because of the time that they grew up, they didn't have the old world to compare it to, and so they were just like, yeah, of course everything's going to be like handed to me and it's already on the internet, and like they've missed that joy of like the seeking to find it themselves.
Yeah, no, I totally hear that. I think too that as millennials are aging into leadership, right? Like we've made this transition from, oh, you get to own the marketing strategy, or I remember I was pulled in to do a pitch on and explain YouTube SERP back in 2011, just by nature of being the young person on the team, to now we are in leadership. And what's interesting too is that we as mentors, like we were um I forget the word. Like, we were also, like, just kinda stretched too thin, right?
Mhm.
We were given a lot of projects that were set up as, like, growth opportunities in the best way, and we're like, "Yes, please, thank you, I would like more of this." And I think that, we worked long hours. I
Yeah.
remember, especially agency side, you probably remember this, you're staying until 2 o'clock in the morning to build a deck that a
Yeah.
managing director is probably just going to tear apart the next day. And so,
At least you got
I
to order burgers at 9 p.m. when
it's
the
true. 9? I stayed until 7. I needed and then, like, I wouldn't remember to submit my expense report, and then I ended up having to pay for it, but that's a rite of passage, right? And so I do think, like, there were a lot of things that we've tried to, advice that we have tried to, give to the next generation that I think they just don't have the lived experience to interpret it in the way that we mean. So, as an
Mhm.
example, when we say, "Bring your whole self to work,"
Oh,
I
yeah.
actually don't mean bring your whole self to every single interaction, okay? Like, what I mean is that feel free to be yourself in a lot of different spaces, but we still have a professional face that we want to put on. Because
Yeah.
just as you have a different conversation that you have with your parents versus your friends, that is the same when you're having a conversation with your colleagues versus your boss versus some clients. And so,
Yeah.
just because I think, and the word comes to mind, just because we were exploited a bit in
Yeah.
our careers, we're trying to give this advice that, again, like, when you don't have the lived experience, it can be misconstrued. And so another example I'll share is this idea of negotiating for what you're worth, right?
Mm.
I agree with this. You absolutely should do this. What I mean is base that on research
Right.
and comps in the marketplace,
Right.
right? Like, when you go and interview, like, have an understanding, or like ask your network what an understanding of like a fair wage is for this job. What
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to do is pull out a random six-figure number when you're 22 and ask for that out of a marketing team, because that is the tech comp. Okay.
Totally.
And so there is a lot of nuance that is lost in this really, I think, valuable and lived advice that we are giving to the next generation.
Totally fair. A small moment of like checking ourselves, right? And just like being a devil's advocate here. I think there's so much of what you just described as your experience in like working crazy, being up to a certain extent exploited, like giving these growth opportunities and whatever, and like also not having the same coaching on like asking for salaries and things like that. Like I I do think that if you had to label in 3 to 5 terms like millennials in the workplace culture, 100% one of those top 5 labels would be hustle culture.
Yeah, boo.
And we are yeah, but we are so, um, ingrained and we have internalized hustle culture in such a real way, and similar to but different than, like, the salary conversation, I think that there is an extreme overcorrection of hustle culture with like some of the newer generations coming into the workforce where they're just like, yeah, I'd love to do that, but it's 5 p.m. Like, could you imagine saying that to a manager of yours
No.
before? But also, can you understand like that actually is reasonable, right? Like in Europe, they're just like, yeah, we that's what we do. Like we
Yes.
have to go. We have an aperitif to enjoy right now and our
And
friends
then
to meet up with.
and we're gonna take the entire month of August off. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I think that's what makes me very hopeful,
Mhm.
of this working relationship that we are building between millennials and Gen Z, is
Yeah,
that I think as millennials, a lot of our self-identity, especially with high performers, is that my work speaks for me. Like my
totally.
identity is my work, right?
Yep,
Is the work product that I put out there, is, I am defined by the things that I do, versus a lot of Gen Z culture is like, hey, I am who I am and I'm going to show up as like me sort of
yeah.
thing, is that I am
And
not
work is like
defined
a
by my work.
component of that.
Exactly. Like
Yeah,
work is a part of my life, but it is not my life.
yeah,
And so I think what we're effectively experiencing is the extreme ends of both sides.
yeah.
And I think that if we work together, we can build this beautiful environment where, yes, we have boundaries, but we are also committed to doing the work until it's done because we take pride in our work as well.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a balance that needs to be struck between like the hustle culture generation and there are so many elements of that are I'm proud to have, right? Like I like the fact that the amount of time that one spends working, even let's just say it's not the 60, 80 hours that at one point in our careers, I'm sure we did and still do
I
every so often.
did a 100-hour week like
Yeah.
once and it was awful.
No, I mean, I wouldn't wish that on anyone, and I'm never advocating for that. Um, but so there's components of just the amount of time that we spend in our lives on our work that if we don't derive any meaning from that time that we invest, I think that's also problematic, right? Because then you start to find issues of like purpose and, all those things can actually impact mental health too. So I guess my point is let's stop sort of glamorizing hustle culture, which I actually think is something that we've already moved away from. And even your like visceral reaction to like the term hustle culture, you're like, God, no, don't say it. But
Yeah.
that's because it's a real thing. I think that if we find that balance to your point about like hustle culture and also like having work not be everything and define who you are as an individual, like I think we as now rising leaders within our organization, we have the power and are gaining more and more power to influence the cultures around us to find that balance.
100%. I think it is about, I'm not trying to be dramatic, although I am a bit of a drama queen sometimes, is that how do we build this new world order where we're
Yeah.
taking the best of both perspectives? And then I mean, we'll probably have to talk about Gen X too, because I feel like they always get forgotten.
I know,
Um,
poor Gen X.
but I do think that we have an opportunity to pave a path and build a world and culture that is sustainable and meaningful. And that I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, we end up teeing a bunch of false choices, right? It's either
Mhm.
this or it's that. It's this or it's that. But the reality is that two things can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I
It's
do
not
think that,
binary.
to your point, there are things like I mean, just think about all the things that were glamorized in hustle culture, right? Like Elon Musk sleeping in a sleeping bag under his desk, and people are like, yeah, he's committed. I was like, I don't know. That just sounds like pretty bad time
Yeah.
management to me.
It
But
sounds like you should be committed.
yeah, so there are definitely things where I think we can be very intentional and thoughtful about the things that we celebrate when it
Yeah.
comes to work, right? And what does it look like to create an environment where we build something meaningful together? That to your point, when we spend, let's say 40 to 50 hours a week at work, that we feel like that time was well spent.
Yeah.
Because no one will ever look back on their life and say, I wish I had worked more, but I think, to go to your earlier point too about relationship building, like that was a lot of what those early years were. I mean, think
Totally.
about how many work friends you had at your wedding versus
Yep.
college friends. And so I do think that there is this disservice to the younger generations where it's like, I think work was more meaningful to us because that was our friend group. And
Yeah.
so I do think that that is a marked difference as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in listening to this, hopefully as a listener, we are in some ways involved in shaping culture and culture that hopefully delivers not only like a better place to work and to be and to spend our time, but ultimately I'm very much in the mindset of without that, you don't get the other things, right? So you're not going to get the great inspirational ideas. You're not going to get the stronger connection to your consumer that you're after in your like strategy deck. So to me, there isn't this like dotted line. There is like a firm, clear line between understanding the dynamics that are underlying your workforce and the people that you rely on to accomplish all of your goals and how they're feeling and what is driving them and what is underlying some of the behaviors and actions that we have to now deal with as managers. It's like, well, let's just meet them where they're at and just it's just a foundational understanding of those generational differences. Now that I don't know what the number is, but I imagine that we're the growing majority of the workforce between Gen X and millennials. And I'll even throw in some of the Gen Xers too, even though they
Only the
straddle
cool
sometimes.
ones.
They are pretty cool. They are. I got to say, they don't get the credit they deserve. Um, but yeah, so we are making up the growing majority of corporations. And so understanding these really meaningful changes. Like the workplace has changed fundamentally, the same way that the retail environment has changed fundamentally due to e-commerce coming out, social media coming out, COVID happening. Like all of these things, just I think deserve to be explored, and not just because the human aspect is important, but because the human aspect is your highway into the strategy and the execution and the results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like at the end of the day, no matter what business you're in a people business. I think marketing more than any other business. And so when we talk about, this new world order of this opportunity to build a better workplace, and then when we talk about building something meaningful, that thing that you are building that is meaningful can be how a brand behaves, right? How a brand behaves with consumers, how a brand shows up. I mean, we can certainly talk about the Bud Light controversy over the past week,
Oh,
but there is this opportunity for us, and I know I'm kind of going back on what I said before, but
that's
of
okay.
this
We
idea.
evolve.
Yeah, I was gonna say we evolve. We also have an editor, but no, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. Um, but this idea of like bringing your whole self to work, I think you can
Mhm.
also bring your values into work in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
Now, you're still going to have to make a judgment call on. You're not going to show up to a Zoom call with a client in your club clothes, right? Do people still go to clubs? I don't know if people go to clubs anymore. But if
Mm,
they did, don't wear those clothes onto client calls. So I do think that that is an area of opportunity as well, which
yeah,
is, hey, you bring your values. How does your brand authentically align with your values? How do you build that in a way that is authentic and meaningful, while still being professionals?
totally. And I think it's similar to the conversation about like, and I do really want to get into the Budweiser thing just as like it's fascinating to talk through. So I want
Hmm.
to let's do it. But in terms of like being professional, there is a school of thought when it comes to like manners, right? Like not
Mm.
outside, like outside of the workplace, the idea of manners and like how to sit at the table and like when what to do with your napkin and all of those types of things. The origin of like manners and rules around that actually stems from the intention to make everyone around you comfortable. Like
Oh, I thought it
there
was
is
so you wouldn't get kicked out of the tribe.
well, I think it's one of those things where like, yeah, I mean, it is definitely tribal, right? And it is like even to a certain extent like classist. You can look at it that way too. Like it comes from royalty and all of that. But the whole idea was that when you go think about when you go to a dinner party and there is like a table set up for let's say 25 people and there's no like place cards. And so everyone has to seat themselves. And there's a level of anxiety that that situation brings up that a host that has experience in like running these types of things actually knows to avoid. So they actually do give you place cards and they're just like they can say, "Oh, this is just a recommendation, sit wherever you want," but like you at least have a go-to. Like, okay, and then when I get there, I know what to do. I know that this is going to be the first course and like taking some of the anxiety out. I promise there's a parallel to
No,
work
I'm
here. Just
excited.
follow me. So like there's a component to manners, not maybe not the entire thing, but there's a huge component to it that is just meant to have a standard operating procedure
Mm.
that everyone can sort of subconsciously agree to that allows for the other focus, hopefully a great conversation, hopefully a delicious meal, hopefully some laughs, hopefully some new friends, like all of those things that like don't have anything to do with what fucking fork you're using. Like
The fish fork, to be
the
clear.
obvious it's always the fish fork. But those things, once they are thought of and taken care of and like sort of taken off the table, allows for the other magical things to start happening. And I do think that there's a component of work etiquette and work manners and professionalism. Some of it goes way too far and it's kind of stupid and outdated. Same thing with manners. But then there are some things that are like, like it's kind of a relief to just know we're going to show up on time. We're not going to, like, we're not going to wear our club tube top, although that might be entertaining. Who knows? Tube top, too. Oh, Jesus Christ, Ingrid, you're really aging us. Well, although I don't know, all the 90s stuff is coming,
I think it's
2000 stuff is coming
back.
back. It's like,
The pro
yeah, they're like the tube tops and the low
Yeah.
waisted. Anyway,
No, no, thank you, hard pass.
I mean, I'm like 7 months pregnant, so it would be really hilarious. I mean, I guess I do have some really low waisted stuff these days. Anyway, but you hear what I'm saying? It's like
Yes,
there's
yes.
manners and there's this thing, and it's like let's just like do the bare minimum of that, and just like get all agree that that's going to happen, so that the actual work and like the good stuff and the juices can get flowing, and we can like get the shit done.
Yeah, I love that. All while wearing tube tops, which sometimes maybe they're mini skirts, who knows? Um, but I do think to your point about corporate etiquette, I think that in the worst way, it is used as gatekeeping, right?
Oh yeah.
Gatekeeping language. If you don't speak the speak, if you don't use the right acronyms, there's an entire TikTok series where a woman asks her friend, she says, "Well, I want to say like stop emailing me because you're being annoying. How do you say that in corporate?" And then
Yeah.
he interprets it for her, right? He was like, your constant reminders are appreciated but not necessary, sort of thing. And
So
so I do think, again, when we talk about the new world order that we get to build, it
yeah,
is how do you use how you show up to work and the norms of that as a way to create less distraction from the meaningful work that's done, but not in a way that is gatekeeping access to
yeah.
everyone.
Oh my gosh. I mean, if another term that now like the digital people, like the second you have like a person that has any form of digital in their title goes into a like goes up to a room, it's like prerequisite that they have acronyms and slang and ways of talking that are like I think at this point like intentionally like
Yes,
gatekeepy and like
yes.
I mean, and now it's just so cringy to me where I'll literally use like the most simple, like a ROAS or whatever. Like I'll
I
just
was
say like
just
return on
thinking
ad
that.
spend, like
Yeah.
just the most basic things. Like I'll say the acronyms so that the digital snobs in the room like know I know what's up. But then for everyone else who actually I want to bring along on the journey, which I have now learned in my career is really important, like just don't talk in the acronyms or use the acronyms, but then explain what they are so that everyone can participate in the conversation. But holy shit, in terms of digital, like gatekeeping, digital people, we created that
Yes.
whole thing.
Guilty as charged. And I think it's
So guilty.
it's paid media specifically, right? When you're talking about ROAS,
Oh yeah.
MER, all those things. And I think that sometimes, and this is something to watch out for as a manager of folks who are early in their career, is that sometimes people use it to hide behind. Right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so just by nature of being able to explain the thing, right? It's like, "Oh, you said ACOS. Like, what does that actually mean? Like,
Uh-huh.
what does it mean in terms of business
LTV.
performance?"
Yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't actually matter how many fancy acronyms you have if you can't simply explain to me what the business impact is. And now I am guilty of this early on because you think that you need to use all the fancy talk or, you can it's like that scene in Clueless where she learns a new word, right? Was sporadically. And she's
Oh
like,
yeah.
now use it in a sentence. Like, that's a lot of what I think my early career was. It's like, oh,
Big
I
time.
learned this fancy new word. But what you realize as you become more experienced and as you age is that the true art is to simplify rather than to complicate.
Yep. And to wrap this whole thing up in a lovely little D2C bow, I actually think that there's truth to that in business strategy as well. Like in actual, not just there's now let's face it, there's a playbook for D2C brands and there's a font and there's a color and there's a,
The
this
color's
is the way,
pastel.
yeah, this is the way we do our photography. And it's just like there's a playbook and we can probably thank Emily Weiss for it. And so I will. But but there's a playbook, and I think that the same way that we should take what we need and leave the rest as it relates to like professionalism and manners and generational differences. I think it's the same thing with D2C. I think we need to take what we need, which is yes, simplification is important. Yes, disrupting old ways of thinking that aren't serving us anymore is super important. But now what? Like, what do we do after we have those lessons? We can't just keep Emily Weissing our way through the universe, although
The answer is
it
we can
wouldn't be
do
a
whatever we want. I mean, like that
Mm.
is I think that and this idea of being able to now I'm also on like tarot card reading TikTok, but the idea of, take what resonates, leave what doesn't.
Yeah,
But like the answer is that we can build anything that we imagine. And I know that for some folks that could be scary, but for some other folks, like that's very energizing, right? And then all of like the old sayings that seem very trite become true, which is be the change you want to see in the world.
totally. Yeah. And I think maybe our next episode will be all about the evolution of D2C and how we think what our forecast is for what D2C brands are going to do in the next decade of their growth and evolution and aging.
I think serif fonts are coming back.
Oh,
Just
thank
kidding.
God. I love
Kidding.
Seraphon. I love Seraphons. Please come back. I love them. They're
Sans
beautiful.
comic,
Shout
stay
out to
away. Comic Sans.
Prada that did not participate in the grand dullification of luxury labels when serif fonts went away. Prada was like, nope, this is us. We're standing in our truth, and I have just so much respect for that. Miu Miu, you're a goddess. Anyway, I am so glad that you're here, and I just am having so much fun talking to you, and I hope the audience is as well. I'd be shocked if they weren't. But also, audience, come on, you got to tell us what you think. Give us some hilarious war stories of generational conflict in your offices. Come to us with some of your questions or some of the drama that's happening, and let's go through it on the show. It'll be super super fun to watch Orchid and I argue about that.
We are debating in a very spirited manner. That's
Yes.
corporate speak for big drama queens.
Totally, totally. No, and sorry, not sorry for that. Well, thank you, Orchid. Anything you wanted to share with the audience before we wrap?
Yeah, I mean, I just hope that this is a message of hope, right? This is a message of us being able to partner with the various lived experiences that we have in our workplace and in our workforce to create something that's meaningful and better. And so, I will echo Ingrid's point of love to hear feedback from you all on what resonates, leave what doesn't. To do what my astrology TikTok says.
Perfect. You're going to have to send me some of those TikToks because I want to get into that algorithm.
It's about like twin flames and stuff. And I was like, I'm married. Like, what do I need a twin flame for?
Cute. I love it. Well, thanks again, and I'll see you all soon.